Hi, my name is Cara McGlynn. I'm the lead school social worker with the Northeast Metro 916, and I'm going to be doing a training for you today on trauma-informed practice skills. So often we have an opportunity to talk about trauma-informed care in a general sense. Um, and one of the things that people often come to me with after that is, well, okay, now what do I do? How does this look in the classroom? How do I show up for kids? So we are going to talk about that today. Okay. So our learning targets today, following the presentation, hopefully you'll be able to name some self-soothing skills that you yourself can use in the moment if you're finding that you're struggling to regulate your own emotions. Oftentimes when we're working with students that have trauma histories, they tend to bring up things in ourselves through forced reenactment scenarios. So we'll talk a little bit about that. You will be able to identify skills that you can use to support students who have trauma histories. And we'll also talk about some interventions that can be used to de escalate dysregulated students. Just a quick review about what trauma is. So we use the definition in our district from SAMHSA, and what they are looking for is three ingredients to equal a trauma: an event, an experience of that event, and then an effect. And it really does have to be one plus one equals two in this scenario. Trauma is very subjective, so many people can experience a similar event or even the same event, but because of their experience, potentially they had lots of supportive, loving caretakers around them, supports to lean into. The effect then may or may not equal trauma. So, an example would be if, see, two children were being bullied at school. One child is able to go home and talk to their caregivers about the scenario, and the parent or caregiver is able to offer them lots of support and reinforcement. Perhaps they go to the school and advocate for the situation and their needs. So, in the end, that child's experience leaves them with the effect that they were really well supported, even though the situation or the event was kind of gross or awful. The aftermath of it is not something that's traumatic. However, if another child goes through the event of bullying and the experience is that there's no one to support them in mitigating those big feelings. Perhaps they're getting bullied or abused at home too. It's likely that the adverse effect will be long term, and that will be something that's similar to trauma or trauma itself. So, again, when we're thinking about trauma, we are looking for an event or a set of circumstances, an experience, and an effect. As a school system, we do a really good job of naming single incidence events, or what we call contextual trauma. If we can name it, we can see it, we can understand it. For caregivers in the school system, teachers, paraprofessionals, social workers, it makes sense in our brain that the effect ends up being traumatic. However, a lot of our students experience something called non contextual trauma. And that's when we think about things like intergenerational or historic trauma, where the event is actually pushed back two to three to potentially four generations, uh, considering like slavery or Native American boarding schools. Um, that event, nonetheless, as a community, is experienced as a trauma where there are physically and emotionally harmful or life threatening adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental health, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well being. So, be thoughtful too when we're talking about trauma. We might be thinking about an event that's not even something that the person is consciously aware of as an event that's impacting their functioning. And that's where it really encourages us to be detectives and be curious about the behavior that we're observing and the feelings that the children are explaining to us that they're having a hard time with. Um, Behavior is communication. Oftentimes when we are dealing with bigger behaviors, it's easy to write off because it impacts us in a really maladaptive way. And that behavior is trying to tell you something. So when you have a student who might not have a contextual trauma, but the behavior is similar to a trauma experience, again, that's a clue that there might be a non contextual trauma for you to be curious about. Regardless, the same practice based behaviors that we are going to discuss here today are best practice in general. So, if the child has a history of trauma, other mental illness, perhaps they are diagnosis like ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, reactive attachment disorder. All of these interventions we are going to talk about are proven to work with these populations as well. So here we go. Um, Before we dig into the intervention strategies themselves, just something for you to think about as you're looking through this presentation or watching this at home. If you were to see this child show up at your school, what would be your first indication to do something for them? For me, if I saw this person, my first inclination would be to grab something or offer to help them hold something. And I definitely meant inclination, not indication. Sorry. So my first inclination would be to hold something for them or offer a hand. The same thing is true when kids come to us with trauma. So, what we have here is a person holding boxes that are labeled with adverse childhood experiences. Now, if you offered to be a holding place for those experiences so that a child could put them away and focus on their schoolwork, think how powerful that is in the relationship with them and what that allows them space it and room to do emotionally and mentally. You're allowing them for a short time to put down this heavy load that they're carrying. It's a lot harder, though, to offer the capacity to hold things when it's this scenario versus, again, if these were just physical boxes that we could see. So here it's more the imaginary scenario of them trying to carry the heavy load of a lot of adverse childhood experiences. Another way to visualize this is to think about traumas or stressors as rocks. And without someone to carry the rocks or lessen the load, it squishes us. So stress piles up. And again, these are some examples of those adverse childhood experiences we talk about. There's another term when we think about trauma that's related to stress. So stress is really helpful and healthy most of the time. However, too much stress for too long can be maladaptive. So I like to think of it as uh, I personally am stressed out when my alarm goes off if I hit snooze because I know I will sleep through like three more alarms. If my boss is watching this, I still get to work on time though. Sorry, I think I'm funny. Anywho, so that stressor of the alarm though pushes me into action. I jump out of bed, I do what I need to do, I get to work on time, I get to work so I can pay my bills, I can have a home, etc., etc. That's healthy, manageable stress. Similar to like when we have really high expectations for kids, all that's teaching people to do is abide by schedules and routines and to hold themselves accountable. However, when a person has experienced really big, scary stress, again, if you look at these labels on these rocks, these are stressors that are adverse experiences. And depending upon what sort of caregiver was available to support this child, if these big things were going on, those stressors may or may not, from the event, the experience of not being supported, turned into the effect of trauma. And we also think of it sometimes in the mental health field as toxic stress. So, that toxic stress is when the cortisol levels in your body are raised, again, too much for too long. I can't emphasize that enough. But it really does change the body physiologically, so that your body is predisposed to respond to minor stressors, even like I said, those healthy things that support us in growing and holding us accountable. um, it turns that response into people assuming everything is that toxic stress. And we have this physiological response where our cortisol levels are raised. Um, that ends up with really unfortunate health outcomes, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, things like that happen in cortisol. It also impacts our neurobiology. So, um, as a child is growing and learning, our brains develop from the bottom up. So, the first thing that develops in our brain is that alarm response because our bodies are trying to survive. So, we know from the minute we are brought into this world, our fight, flight, freeze. To be fair, babies only have the freeze response when they're born. And it's that screaming that happens, and that's them telling the people around them that they have a need. Now, as the brain continues to develop, the last part of our brains to develop is this frontal cortex here. And that's where decision making happens. Now, our learning brain still goes online around school age. However, again, being able to make healthy choices comes online last. So even though you might have a child in your classroom who at times can go in and out of that learning brain. Maybe they have a lot of trauma history though, so they keep going to their downstairs brain, that amygdala response. They're still going to really struggle to make good decisions. And if you're already impulsive because developmentally you don't have the capacity to make decisions, and you're constantly in that fight, flight, freeze response, it's really hard to sit still in class. So be thinking about that as we move into some of the strategies. Okay, so there are lots of menu options that you can provide children and yourself to cope in the moment. Now, I say yourself because it is perfectly normal to have interactions in the school day in which you yourself have either that heightened alarm response, so that stress that's maybe toxic, or you're experiencing some re-triggering of your own past trauma. This happens a lot when we're working in special education and higher levels of setting. The bigger the behaviors and the longer we deal with them, the more likely we are to have our own alarm response. That does not mean that you are not amazing at your jobs. It means that you're human. And with that knowledge, it gives us then the capacity to figure out skills to support ourselves in those hard moments. So, this is an invitation to forgive yourself for being human and to find some skills to support you so that if you are having those responses, you know how to get recentered because it is only good for you and the students for you to be regulated emotionally. So, some things that are known to work: gum. Cinnamon and mint gum in the moment can be very grounding. Those smells support our sensory system, and they tend to give us more of an alert or awake response. But again, just feeling the gum, you can be very mindful with it, thinking about the taste, the texture, the smell, all of that can center you. Taking a couple of deep breaths when something's going on. And that is not to say you have to leave the space. You can certainly stay engaged in the classroom, but if something's going on that's starting to get stressful, just closing your eyes for a brief moment, that's it. That can get your system back online and keep you centered and calm. However, it's not always safe to close your eyes. So even just going to maybe a corner, especially if you're feeling stressed, it's important that you feel safe in this space. But putting your hands on your stomach is going to be really important because just like we teach the students, you want to breathe into that balloon of your stomach. It's going to give you a nice deep breath, and you're going to exhale nice and slow. You're going to breathe in through your nose and exhale through your mouth. If you are one of those people who likes pressure, acupressure can be really helpful. There's a ton of really great resources online that are evidence based. And a really simple one is just to pinch right here, not hard, but you're just going to put a little bit of pressure. And there's a pressure point here that, again, helps us get grounded. And it's about the mindfulness practice. So you want to pay attention to the sensation of your finger and your thumb pushing on that pressure point. And that's going to help center you. Some people also wear an elastic around their wrist at work. And that pressure, again, if you're paying attention to it, can be very centering. An imagination barrier can be helpful. This is more of a proactive strategy. If you know that you are going into a space and place where you might be triggered. Maybe you had a really hard day with a student and it's a new day and you're feeling really anxious about dealing with them again or being in the same space with them. An imagination barrier can be really helpful. What it is you are imagining a shield between you and the stressor. And you can, if you're really artistic, get ornate about it. I have students who like to draw a shield, staff who describe the texture, the weight, the space of it, and bringing that with them into the space can be really supportive because it is this idea that they are them, you are you. And even though their words and behaviors can impact you, just like you could hit up against a shield, it still can't impact your body or your space. Self talk is another positive strategy. It's important, again, that the self talk is positive, though, too. There are times where you will notice, especially as staff are working towards burnout or fatigue, that their self talk is very negative. If you are catching yourself in that space, it is worth surrounding yourself with positive people and even taking some time to listen to TED Talks if that's an interest of yours or a podcast, or even seeking some professional help. Again, there's no shame in any of these. This is all about we're all human, we all need help sometimes. But those positive pep talks in the morning can be really powerful, especially in your classroom teams. Different staff that I work with have classroom cheers, classroom chants, and they will get up together before students enter their space and do a little, it's going to be a great day. You are a great educator. We've got each other's backs. Woohoo! Um, I think it's better usually when they do it, but that was just an example. um, good thing I'm in quarantine with myself because I find myself amusing. Reminders of our why is a really positive coping strategy, too. Why did you get into this work? Why do you love this work? Why do you care about your students? That really hard student, why do you keep trying with them? It's not because your boss told you to. There's something inspiring about the connection and relationship that's happening. And the more we remind ourselves of that, the better. And lastly, fidgets. Now, I want to be thoughtful. When we're talking about fidgets, you can use something really overt, like thinking putty or fidget spinners or cubes, if that's comfortable. You can also use something as simple as jewelry. I do that a lot. I use whatever I have on when I'm in meetings. It goes under a table, and I'll twist and turn things. If you have a badge tag on or lanyard, you can use the different buttons or pins on there as fidgets as well. Keys are really good. So it doesn't have to be an overt fidget or something that's identified as a fidget. Paper clips work really great too. Maybe take just a moment here and think about some other things that you do in the moment to get recentered. Okay, so how do we respond to a student in crisis and help them get back into their learning brain? Um, and I want to be thoughtful. Crisis, there's varying degrees. If we think of crisis on a spectrum, there are students who come into our buildings right off the bus with really, really, really hard stuff, and that's impacting and impairing their ability to learn. The same as a student who maybe later in the day, there's something really big that happens that pushes them into that alarm or crisis response too. So, thinking about a student's need is really thinking about meeting them where they're at in the moment. And you'll realize that maybe what one child is expressing, again, on that spectrum of crisis in a really big, bold way, is the same need that child who's coming in, who's really shut down, withdrawn, and quiet, is telling you their need is too. So, what we have is a large menu of practice skills. I broke it into some sections for you in hopes to make it more accessible, but I am going to go through them, and you also have a one pager to take with you. And I do hope that you'll refer back to it. The idea is, again, we're human, we forget things. I fully expect that as this training is going on, perhaps you're people parents and you're also trying to provide education to your children, or your pet parents and cats and dogs are jumping around you. Maybe you have a roommate who's noisy. So this is not something that you're expected to memorize, which is why it's helpful to have this one pager. It's important, though, in all trauma informed work that our message to our students is that they are not alone. We are here with them to deal with our hard things together. This joining process is really the crux of the work. If you have that really strong relationship with the child, that's where the change happens. The coolest part about trauma, which sounds cheesy, but yeah, there's a cool part. And it is that trauma heals in the context of relationships. So if you find yourself doing these strategies and gosh, they're just not working, then I would encourage you to go back to the relationship. Do you have one with that child? Okay. So, what do you say to someone? Typically, when people are really escalated, you want to say less. They're not processing the words you are saying. So, when a person is really heightened, the best you can do is just be there with them. If you are having to provide them any sort of direction, you're not going to be talking about consequences. You're not going to be problem solving with them. It's just going to be, I need you to leave the space, or whatever that direction is. It's going to be important too that when you say what you say, you're going to have a really flat affect almost, and your voice is going to be really quiet and really slow. So if I see a child having a hard time, or I'm working with one, things I might say, I hear you. That sounds really hard. It looks like you're having a hard day. Do you want to try math or reading? You can offer them different subjects of choice if that's appropriate, or you can even offer them a skill in this moment if it's appropriate in your role too. So, do you want to try to breathe with me, or should we chew some gum? If you are offering them a skill, it's important that they've practiced this prior to the crisis. So think about their behavior management plan. Think about techniques that your other classroom staff have used with students before offering this skill. Spec- Specifically and explicitly remind the student you are here for them and you will be available to them when they're ready to process. So you might say, I'm here for you when you're ready. Ask them what happened and also support them by naming a potential emotion. When people have a lot of experience with trauma, they tend to only feel mad, sad, or happy. So it's important, especially as children age, that we teach them that there's a broad range of affect. Wow, you look really frustrated. Is that right? Now, if you're wrong, they will absolutely tell you that too. And it's okay to be wrong. A lot of times that actually can strengthen the relationship as you're getting to know a kid. Because the next time you'll know, oh, actually, they were looking tired or they were looking anxious, whatever that word was. Um, Again, you're going to want to have a really calm body. So it's important to do a body scan of yourself throughout incidents every like 15 to 30 seconds when you're working with a student in crisis, just to make sure that your shoulders aren't up here because that can look threatening. So, bringing those shoulders out of your ears, taking a deep breath, keeping your own emotions regulated, keeping your body open. Um, Closed off makes it feel like people can't approach you. And if a child is in that downstairs brain, that fight, flight, freeze, they're scanning for threats. And this can look threatening if your arms are crossed while you're staring them down. Um, Also, you don't need to like stare them down. Maintaining eye contact isn't always appropriate when someone's in crisis. On that, I would say take the student's lead. A lot of times it can be more comfortable for them if you're actually next to them instead of head on. We talked about taking a non threatening stance, proximity. So, be aware of where you are in the space in relation to the student. It's hard to see because I'm sitting, but I'm very short. I'm like 5'4". So if I am working with a staff who is 6'2" and they are close to me, um, because of that height difference, they are going to feel a lot scarier if I'm in that alarm response. So if that's you, try to get down to the student's level as best as possible. And keep in mind safety. Safety is always number one. If a student is getting physical, you don't want to be within hitting or kicking range, but you can still get down to their level with plenty of space between you. It's really important too that when students are dysregulated, you're not using touch. Um, there may be an instance if you are trained in CPI or PCM that given that instruction, you may have to use a restrictive procedure. That is always last on our menu of options because in the moment that touch feels terrifying to the child. So if you're just trying to regulate with them and get them before they hit that big crisis, you're trying to interrupt. By putting your hands on a child, you might actually send them through the roof. So just be really aware of giving them lots of space when they're feeling escalated. As I demonstrated earlier, you're going to want to lower the volume and pitch of your voice. You're going to stay really matter of fact, regardless of the situation. You might be really upset, and it's important that in this moment, you don't show that to the student. Once everything's calm, absolutely, there is an opportunity to express those feelings to them if it's age appropriate and to problem solve and work through that situation. But in the moment, it's really, really imperative that you are able to mask those big feelings you might be having because it's too much for the child's brain. You're going to speak in short sentences without a lot of questions. You're going to slow yourself down. And that might include needing to slow your own heart rate. And that goes back to what are those coping skills can you use in the moment? You're going to take pauses for processing. When people are in their amygdala response, that fight, flight, freeze, it can take 5 to 10 minutes for someone to fully comprehend what you're saying. And even then, your short term memory is really impaired, so they likely won't recall it later. And if we're thinking about students with disabilities on top of it, if we're giving them multi step directions, it's likely that they cannot comprehend them when they're in crisis. If you do have to give a directive, make sure that it's very short and allow for a lot of processing time before you give another directive. 2 minutes is perfectly acceptable. It might feel like a long time, but it's taking that long for some students to even process that simple step direction. And if we're working in a team at that moment, one of the best things we can do is to reduce the amount of team members involved. Oftentimes, we all want to jump in when there's a crisis situation to help, which is amazing. You care about kids, that's why you work in schools. The problem is, if a child is in their downstairs brain, that amygdala response, and they see more and more adults, that feels really threatening. And it's impossible for even a couple of adults to calm that child down with a whole bunch of other adults standing around. So if a couple of adults have the situation handled, make eye contact with them, do a little check-in across the hall. But if they give you the signal to go ahead and keep it going, keep going. Uh, some other techniques that are helpful. If you are being targeted by a student in a crisis moment, tag out. Uh, have a system with your peers in your classroom and in your learning communities where you can just tap someone on the shoulder and they know you're going to go and the next staff's going to tag in. If you are the target in a moment, you are not going to be the person that's going to calm that student down, regardless if it makes sense that you're the target or not. It has nothing to do with you, and it has everything to do with how that child's brain is processing in the moment. It's important that every interaction we have with children, we establish ourselves as safe, consistent, and reliable staff. We show up when we say we're going to show up. We do what we say we're going to do. We are there for them when we need them to be, or when they ask us to be. So, another way to think of it in child development, we talk a lot about always be bigger, wiser, and kinder for children. And that, when I say children, I mean anyone under 25. Your brain is still developing up until that point, and they need adults around them to support them by being bigger, wiser, and kinder. And I mean that emotionally bigger. Like, I can handle all those big emotions they bring to me, and I'm not going to judge them about it, and I'm certainly not going to persecute them for it. It's important that in your classroom, you create an environment of respect. And again, this is when people are calm. And we do this through things like restorative practices, community building circles, being able to share with one another. Again, just having those authentic relationships. It's important as adults that we model making mistakes and apologize with grace. I don't know how many times in my career I've had to apologize to a child because I was wrong. And that's okay. If anything, that strengthens the relationship. And again, it's just naming that you're human too. And hopefully, they will understand that they can give themselves grace when they do human things. A lot of times, kids with trauma experiences and histories don't have the experience of anyone ever apologizing and fixing it with them. They also don't know how to allow themselves to mess up because it always feels like if I mess up, I'm going to get hurt. But if they can mess up and not have it be this disaster, it again develops some capacity in them for learning. A lot of learning is failure. If you think about some of maybe the best lessons you learned, it's because you messed something up. But if you don't feel safe enough to do that, you're not going to get that really important life experience that supports us into adulthood. Avoiding power struggles is really important to do too. And this is hard because we're the adults and they're in our school. And children will always win. Um, all that will happen if you get into a power struggle is that you will end up feeling really icky afterward, and you'll have done maybe some damage that was unintended. Again, you can refer back to this at any time, but since you're not here to ask questions, we are going to move on to practicing these skills. We did talk about relationships, but gosh, I can't talk about it enough. None of these skills are going to work if you don't have a relationship with a child. So it is important to get to know kids, get to know things they like, get to know things they dislike. Let them get to know you. Relationships are about two people. So I'm not saying that boundaries are not important. They are. They are super important. And there are things that you can disclose to kids within a relationship with staff that makes them feel safe with you. So I like to talk about my dogs. I'll show students pictures of them. I have pictures of my family in my office, pictures of my nephews, pictures of places I visited. Things like that are really easy ways for them to ask questions. And then I also don't feel like I'm putting my business or my needs on them. I think a lot of times too, if you really tend to hold those boundaries hard, it feels weird to talk about yourself at all. But again, it's this parallel process. They learn a little bit about you, you learn a little bit about them. And hopefully in that, you can show them that you are that safe, reliable adult that they need. Okay, so we are going to talk about some scenarios. And when we talk about these next three scenarios, I want you to refer back to that skill sheet and think about some things that you as the staff can be doing. Now, these may or may not apply contextually to your space, but I tried to make them general enough. So bear with me. So scenario one. Scenario one, Lindsay's the student. Lindsay was making disruptive noises, blurting and making inappropriate comments when instruction was being given and calling the teacher inappropriate names. School staff made multiple attempts to redirect her. She was asked if she needed to go take a break. Staff tried working one-on-one with her, tried to engage her in the class activity. She yelled while she was leaving the class, and staff were trying to get her to stay in class at that point, but she decided to still walk out. Staff went with her and explained that she was not where she was supposed to be, so OOP, out of place, and she was refusing to go into a directed space, so some sort of breakout space. Instead, she decided to roll on the floor, disrupt others in class, yell at staff in the classroom, and continue name calling and swearing. So yeah, that sounds like a Monday. um, if you're working in special ed, that happens. So, what can we do? So, anytime we think about a situation with a student and we're able to reflect in this way, there's really three different points of intervention. There's proactive intervention. So, what could you all have done as educators to set up Lindsay's classroom space to maybe avoid any of this happening? There's in the moment intervention. So, what do you need to do in order to support Lindsay's needs, but also to make it so that she's not impacting the learning of her peers? And then there's postvention. So, after the situation's over, what do you need to do to support Lindsay so this either doesn't happen again, or if it does happen again, you have a different process of going about it? So, if you refer back to your sheet, uh, why don't you take just a moment to think about what you could have done again proactively in the moment and post intervention to support Lindsay? So, some things in reflection that made sense to me. So, proactively avoiding those power struggles. If Lindsay's making disruptive noises and inappropriate comments, if her volume is not impacting her peers, it's enough that we can ignore it. If we decide to continue to call it out, she's going to keep getting bigger. That is not to say that we should not address and correct the behavior. It's just saying in the moment with her peers in the room and other staff, she has that audience that's going to fuel that behavior to get bigger and bigger the more we name it. Now, if she is impacting or impairing others' ability to learn, absolutely, we need to do something else. And that's when we think about those choices that we give her. Again, we're avoiding a power struggle, we're offering her choices. So those are two really good interventions in and of themselves. And hopefully Lindsay's willing to come along with us and work one-on-one with that staff or go to that breakout space. However, if she's not, what we could do too is make sure that when we're giving her direction, we're giving her simple step direction and we're giving her time to process. It says staff made multiple attempts to redirect her. So if you are making multiple attempts, but it's Lindsay, take a break, Lindsay, take a break, Lindsay, you need to get out of the classroom, that feels very different than Lindsay, you can go to a breakout space and we can work one on one, or you can remain in the class, but the words have to stop. And then you're going to stare at her for like 30 seconds and you're going to count that in your head and you're going to give her those choices again. Um, and then hopefully she'll tell you what she needs. Other things that could have been helpful, potentially getting down to her level. If Lindsay was smaller than the staff that was giving her the direction, that might have created a power dynamic that fueled the situation. And then thinking about interrupting this earlier. So, as I said before, it may not be worth even calling out this behavior if it's low level. Again, if she's making these like little noises and things that aren't impairing her other peers' ability to learn, you could ignore it. Or as soon as she started doing those little noises, for her, maybe that's the cue. You need to get her out of the class because it's going to get bigger. I think this speaks to just really needing to know your student. For a kid like Lindsay in this scenario, if we could have grabbed her at the beginning and gotten her out of class, not actually grabbed her, like intervened with her behavior, sorry. If we could have intervened with her at the beginning, we might have been able to completely avoid all of this other escalation. And potentially that's having, if they're switching classroom to classroom, her favorite staff waiting outside of the room before she even gets there to do a small check in. Thinking about those plans that can be done, again, so that kids feel safe and supportive, and so that she can be regulated to come back to class. Potentially, this was right after lunch. Maybe Lindsay needs some quiet time if she's transitioning between spaces and places before she's able to engage in her learning brain again. when we think about unstructured time and kids coming from unstructured time to structured time, um, we really need to be curious about how we can support them because that's hard. So, again, looking at those practice based behaviors, maybe you're doing some of those calming strategies with Lindsay as soon as she comes in the classroom. So, if you had other ideas, none of them are wrong. Again, these are just a menu of options. And like I even said in Lindsay's scenario, depending upon how Lindsay was presenting, it might have been worth ignoring or intervening right away. So you're never going to have anything done wrong as long as you're doing the best you can by kids in the moment and you're maintaining your own emotional regulation. When we fly off the handle, that's when we do not good stuff. So, as long as that's not happening, you're not going to make a bad choice here. So, scenario two, in this, we are observing Claire, who is a fellow paraprofessional or education assistant, and she's in a power struggle with a student named Billy. Billy is refusing to go to class and sitting on the bench. Claire is given the direction multiple times to Billy to go to class. Billy then says, bad words, this is why no one likes you. And Claire responds back, no one likes you either. And I don't care if you get a consequence and leaves. So directed study, and this is a consequence. Um, as the observer of this, what is your response? So this one's a little trickier. I'm asking you to think about how you can help Billy, and I'm asking you to think about how you can help your peer Claire here. Just as I said earlier, it's so important that we keep our own emotions regulated. And this is an invitation for you to think about how Claire might be just coming from this area of burnout and not intentionally trying to hurt Billy's feelings or cause harm, but really that response does. So, why don't you take just a moment and think about it? Okay. So, some things that make sense to me here, if again we're thinking about proactive intervention, in the moment responses, and then post intervention that can help. Uh, as a team, it's really important that you check in with one another. Maybe Claire has some really hard things going on at home right now. And if she's able to share that with the team, and gosh, she's having a really hard time with this student, you can say, hey, Claire, why don't you let me work with Billy today? Um, those sorts of conversations are not judgments passed. That is just being a safe, supportive coworker. So I really encourage you to think about how in your buildings and classrooms you can develop a culture where people support one another too, so that an invitation to work with a student is not seen as belittling that other person's ability. It's seen as being supportive. Another thing to think about is so that would be proactive. So in the moment, if you see her, like you said, the first line is you observe Claire in a power struggle. You can tag out with her. Again, this is a practice behavior that we have to learn before situations happen. But whatever that tag out protocol is in your classroom or building that you agree on, just being able to say, like, hey, you go take a break. I got this. That gives Claire the opportunity to go take care of herself and re regulate, and gives Billy the opportunity to work with a staff who's in control in that moment, who can help him hopefully problem solve and get back to class. Because the goal in all of this is still to get Billy back to class. Even if Billy gets a consequence for not being in class, we still want him to be back in class. So be thinking about that. And then lastly, a post intervention would be having some sort of reflective practice as a school team. Again, this is not about shaming, but it's about leaning on positive self care. So things like, hey, Claire, I noticed you really were having a hard day. What are you going to do today to take care of yourself? And this is not hitting the bar for happy hour. A lot of educators tend to go to that as their first self care. That's not self-care, that's, social, and that's okay. Some people are social beings, but things to be thinking about for Claire, like, is Claire getting her emotional needs met? And how can she fill up her cup so her empathy is open and available for others? So, thinking about that. Also, offering some coaching to Claire. And again, this happens in safe professional relationships with people that are on the same level. I have lots of school social workers that are my peers that coach me at times, and likewise, I coach them. It's not about shame or blame. It's about how do we get better in our practice to help kids. And the more we keep kids at the center of the conversations, the less personal people are likely to take it. So perhaps you can offer her some coaching. Another thing to think about is if your building or site is using restorative practices, or even if it's not, just how can Claire fix this with Billy after the fact? Because she has to, if she's going to be able to continue to work with Billy. And that even comes back to that practice based skill of apologizing gracefully. So, all right. This is our third and final scenario to talk through. So, Jeremy was redirected several times about his language and dirty jokes in an interaction with a peer. This continued off and on throughout the class period. Jeremy stepped out of the classroom for the second time in one class period, which means that he had to work in an alternative class space. So, directed study is what they name it here. Uh, Jeremy, though, was refusing to go where he needed to go to a workout space. Staff directed him to stay away from the other student, who was also being told to go to a separate space. Jeremy threatened the staff, coughed up phlegm, and was going to spit on the staff, but then spit by their feet. And then Jeremy threatened to find out where the staff lived and threatened to attack them. So yeah, this is big. This is a big incident. This is crisis. So thinking about again, proactive in the moment and post intervention. Um, what could we have done? So proactively, well, sorry. Go ahead and take a moment to think about it, and then I'll jump in. Okay, so the best case in this scenario would have been to intervene sooner. If we could have gotten Jeremy and the peer split up from one another before Jeremy was in and out of the classroom, before the behavior really escalated, that would have been ideal. It does seem that Jeremy was targeting his classroom staff. So potentially the person to ask Jeremy to leave the space would have been either a staff of preference or a staff from outside of the classroom. So again, thinking about your building and classroom spaces, what are those plans that you can put into place to support students when they're struggling? So even though this seems like Jeremy was just being immature and goofy, again, behavior is telling us something. So, thinking about what that unmet need is can be a proactive intervention too. Perhaps Jeremy gets really off like this when things are happening at home that are really bad or hard. This maybe occurs when Jeremy isn't getting enough food. So, having a snack for him. Again, this is an invitation for us to be curious, but that would likely be either the beginning of an incident or way after. So, if this has gone on and we could not proactively intervene by immediately getting Jeremy either working with the preferred staff or out of the classroom space, some other things to think about would be how we are interacting with Jeremy. So, if we're the staff he's targeting, if we're the staff he's refusing to go with, again, we need to tag out with another staff. It's not about you, it's about what Jeremy needs in that moment. And I would suspect if this was going on for a while, staff that are interacting with Jeremy might be losing their flat affect. They might be sounding annoyed. Jeremy, I need you to go to that space, right? So I would wonder if during the intervention, if staff were totally regulated and calm, it's possible that maybe they were using some of those threatening stance pieces. Maybe they're bigger than him, so there's that size differential. So all of those things likely came into play as Jeremy continued to escalate. Then, of course, when the actual incident happens, making threats about staff and hurting them is a really serious thing. So we would want to call, again, whoever the crisis interveners are in your building. So in our buildings, it's our school social workers. We would come, we would talk with Jeremy, we would talk about the threat and how realistic that is. There'd be a call home where we'd collaboratively problem solve with the parent. And then we'd also be working with Jeremy to fix it with the staff. It's really important that, again, as staff, we're being asked to be bigger, wiser, and kinder. And in these moments, it might feel like we don't want to deal with Jeremy for a while. And I would hope that you can get to a place where you can work with Jeremy, you're open to working with Jeremy. And part of that is telling Jeremy what he said to you was not okay. When we avoid students or sever that relationship, um, again, that doesn't make us bad. That makes us human. We're having an emotional response to what happened. And our students need us to work through that, sometimes quicker than we feel comfortable with, and we have to. And in order to do that, that requires us to lean on our safe, supportive people and occasionally even some of those professional, safe, supportive people. So, different districts that we work with bring in professional debriefers. There's employee assistance plans. There's professional therapy. Working through that though, so that the student has the opportunity then to repair with you, is vital to that student being able to function and feel safe in that building, and for you too. It's vital that you be able to tell them, it was really gross when you threatened to spit on me and you hurt my feelings. And I still like you and want to work with you. Um, our students who have trauma experiences are used to being cut off, they're used to people avoiding them. As they move up in special education, they're used to failing and not having reparative interactions with people. So, as often as we're able to provide that, I invite you to please give us an opportunity to repair the relationship if things like this happen. As a post intervention, it's really helpful. And the likelihood that this behavior will happen again, at least towards you, is lower. I'm not going to say it's never going to, but once kids have that really authentic, genuine repair, they typically don't engage in this unless this is really just a problem behavior. And again, it's not about you. That's about, in this moment, what Jeremy needs. So, just to wrap up, some final things about post intervention. So, again, after all three of these scenarios, it's important that we reconnect and repair with the student. Sorry, it's a scholar here. The site I work at, we use both interchangeably. Um, in order to reconnect and repair with a student, every day you have to show up and be happy to see them authentically. Uh, and if you can't do that that day, again, we're human, but make sure that somebody is there who can show up for them and be happy to see them. It's important that you participate in student activities. Any opportunity to have pro social interactions with kids is so important. So definitely participate. Again, model expressing feelings in a safe and supportive manner. Acknowledge when you get something wrong and apologize. It's important to be human in front of kids. Accept that they and we as staff need time to process too. So, hard things happen, and it might take a day or two before we're ready to work through it. It might take a few minutes, even in a moment, before we're able to process the words that are being said and how things are happening. That's okay. That's just our brain trying to keep up with what the rest of our physiological response is in crisis. So just know that that happens. That happens to you, it happens to them. Also, give grace when possible. You need it sometimes too, and our students desperately need it. Grace isn't giving them a pass. It's just allowing them to make mistakes and be human and giving them an opportunity to fix it. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me. If you have any questions, I have my information on here. I'd be happy to answer them. And I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much and have a good day.